This is your Tuesday Daily Delivery. I am Michael Rand. We got a lot to get to today. Sometimes I say that, and I mean it, but I don't mean it. Today I really mean it. We got a lot of good stuff coming up. Got to talk some Vikings here in a little bit because they made some news on Monday. Got Chip Scoggins, columnist, on the show here in a little bit too. Had a really interesting piece in Sunday's paper on the kind of confluence of legal, charitable gaming, a lot of pull tabs, and youth sports, and how that is funding a lot of youth sports in a big way, the big business of charitable gaming. I've got a thought on the St. Paul Saints I want to share. I've got an update on Bally Sports North, and a little Kirill Kaprizov update as well. But first, what did I miss? Teased it at the outset. Yeah, Vikings. Couple things they did on Monday. Brought in Michael Osterholm. We should talk about that for just a minute, to talk to the team about the vaccine, to try to help improve what has been a lagging rate of vaccination on this team. Love the move. Love just, getting these guys who are vaccine holdouts for whatever reason more information. Hopefully the FDA approval, the full approval Monday too of the Pfizer vaccine, might have a nudge in that direction, not just with the Vikings, but in the greater country, and with people who are vaccine holdouts as well. So like that, hopefully that has some impact. We're still close to 3 weeks away from the season, so if guys can start the process now and get things going, they can be they can have the benefits of that and be fully inoculated not too long into the season. The bigger news on Monday, though, was the Vikings deciding to bring back Everson Griffen. Now, they had brought him in for a workout last week. It wasn't clear if they were going to sign him. We talked on the Access Vikings podcast last week. Maybe they're going to look and see how their other defensive ends did during the second preseason game, and they must have looked at it and said, Everson Griffen can help us. Mike Zimmer pretty clear that Griffen doesn't figure to be a starter necessarily. That's obviously subject to change. Everything is based on performance, but someone who can help them out situationally, has had a ton of sacks in his career, was a star for this team on some very good defenses. So if he's got some stuff left in the tank, that will be helpful. The bigger thing, though, is just there's two things about this that are not surprising at all, and one that is surprising. Let's start with the things that aren't necessarily surprising. One, bringing back an old friend. The Vikings love to do that, and in fact, this is the third that I can count. Third former player already, actually fourth former player they've brought back already this year to be on this defense. You got Sheldon Richardson, you got Stephen Weatherly, you got Mackenzie Alexander, and now you've got Everson Griffen. Mike Zimmer loves familiarity on his defense. He loves the continuity. He loves guys that can step into that scheme, loves guys who he knows what they can do, or at least knows what they've been able to do in the past. So another familiar face on this defense. Another unsurprising thing about this is it's a defensive upgrade. The Vikings have spent pretty much their entire offseason, at least in free agency, adding defensive players. Now, I thought it was interesting because I needed to know what the total was on all this. So I went to Spot Track, not necessarily the end all be all, but pretty good with contracts, knowing what the guaranteed money is, stuff like that. I count 8 different players that the Vikings have signed from other teams this offseason on defense. I mentioned a few of them just a minute ago, but let's go through the whole list. Dalvin Tomlinson, Patrick Peterson, Sheldon Richardson, Brashad Breeland, Stephen Weatherly, Xavier Woods, Nick Vigil, and Mackenzie Alexander. And then now Everson Griffen would make 9 since he did play for Detroit and Dallas last season. The numbers on Griffen aren't in yet in terms of contract, but in terms of guaranteed money, those guys at signing, that was $32 million the Vikings invested in the defense. Most of these guys on short-term, 1-year deals, kind of showing that they're loading up for this year. But still, it's a lot of guaranteed money, and they'll probably end up making more if they all make the team, which it seems like all of those guys are probably going to make the team. On offense, what was the guaranteed money they've given out? $137,500 to D.D. Westbrook. That's the guaranteed money on offense spent on outside free agents. And you can say, Mason Cole, they got him in a trade. I don't know how much guaranteed money that is, but it's not much. And then you've got, they definitely invested in the draft on offense too, with some offensive linemen, things like that. But if you're talking about just pure free agency, the Vikings went all in on the defense this year and barely spent it all on upgrading the offense. And you can say, well, that makes sense. The offense was pretty good last year. The defense was bad. Yeah, I get it, but I still wish they would have spent a little more on the offensive line in particular. Now the surprising part. Coaches hate disruptions. Coaches hate distractions. Everson Griffen has the potential to be that because of what he said, last year in a couple different instances. One, kind of going off on, Zimmer's comment on him being a good player before they were going to play Detroit last year. And then going off on Twitter, social media, just 8 months ago, calling out Kirk Cousins, using a word that I'm not going to use on this podcast, and then also saying Mike Zimmer never wanted him, didn't want him here, asked Mike Zimmer if he wanted Kirk, things like that. He did address that. I will give him credit. He got asked about that on Monday. Everson Griffen did in his return to the Vikings news conference. Here's what he had to say about that Twitter exchange.
I haven't really talked to him yet, but I'm gonna get around to doing that. Apologize to him. Apologize to Coach Zim and Rick about what I said. I take full ownership in that. But I still got to talk to Kurt and apologize to him about that.
Now that said, you can apologize, but you can't unsay what you said. If this becomes a thing in the locker room, if Kirk Cousins is upset about this, and some of you, I wrote about this yesterday. Some of you don't care. Some of you are so mad at Kirk Cousins for various things. Vaccine hesitancy being at the top of that list, and I get that. I'm upset with him about that too. But if your bottom line is winning this year, you need Kirk Cousins. Your other quarterbacks are not ready. That was the point I was trying to make in what I wrote yesterday. It seems like an odd business decision to upset your quarterback. I get it that you're probably just at your wit's end on a lot of things with him. You've had him this is his fourth year. Hasn't gone the way you wanted to in a lot of ways. You've only made the playoffs once. He's made a lot of money. I get all that. But if you want to win in 2021, if you want to have a good offense in 2021, you need Kirk Cousins, and bringing in a guy who at this point is a situational pass rusher who could disrupt some of Kirk Cousins and what he wants to do in terms of how he feels. I'm surprised by that because coaches hate that. We'll see if it plays out. We'll see if there's an apology, and it doesn't really matter. If it does come up later in the season, though, don't forget this moment.
I'm Chris Hine, Timberwolves beat writer at the Star Tribune and the first 5-time guest in daily delivery history. Thank you for listening to this podcast. This work is made possible by our Star Tribune subscribers. For unlimited access to the articles mentioned in this podcast, our coverage of Minnesota sports from pros to preps, and even all of Rand's future blog posts about how the Timberwolves should trade for players they will never get, go to startribune.com/subscribe.
Really happy to be joined on Daily Delivery Day by Chip Scoggins, columnist and enterprise writer for the Star Tribune, and the piece you had Sunday kind of falls into that latter category. Chip, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Michael. How are you?
I'm good. Really interesting story you had Sunday on charitable gaming and kind of its impact on youth sports in the state. I got to be honest, Chip, I read it. I had a vague idea. Obviously, I haven't spent as much time in bars lately, just, for a number of different reasons, COVID, having kids, things like that. Just, I don't go out as much, but obviously have an understanding that when you play pull tabs, it's funding something. It's not like I've never played a few pull tabs before, but I had no idea the scope of this. Maybe at the start, can you give me some of the numbers and even just how you kind of got into reporting and writing this story about the business of charitable gaming and youth sports?
Yeah, sure. I'll tell you how I got into it. And it fascinated me in the same way that you did you. Is my wife was on the city council out here in Woodbury. She no longer is, but last fall, a pull tab issue came up with the city. And so they did a study, and she came home from the meeting that night, and she's like, asked me if I knew how much youth sports associations make off pull tabs. And I'm with you. I'm not a big bar guy, and I don't know that I've ever played pull tabs. I've seen them in bars, right? But I've never paid attention to them that much. And I said, I don't know, 20,000. And she said, try, and I forgot the number, but it was something like 700,000. I'm like, what? And the study that they had commissioned was they'd gotten the data from the state gambling control board, which every year puts out a report on each organization throughout the state that has a gambling license. And so I called them. I'm like, is this normal? And they're like, oh yeah, this is a big deal. And so what I found out, so I started doing reporting. It just fascinated me that this relationship, and as a vital fundraising source for youth sports organizations, charitable gambling, primarily pull tabs, that makes up like 95% of it, but there's some bingo and different games like that, but primarily pull tabs. So just gambling alone, charitable gambling in the state in 2020, total sales, $2.1 billion. Of those total sales,
$2.1 billion.
We like to gamble. Of that, there's 183 youth sports organizations that have license. You have to have a gambling license. You have to have a gambling manager. But to operate a pull tabs booth or operate bingo, you have to have a license. And there's 183 sports organizations in the state that have those. And they made up 30% of that $2.1 billion in sales. And so they don't get all that money, obviously, in taxes, expenses, different things go into that. But just the sheer volume, and these associations rely on it because youth sports have gotten expensive. Ice time, training, all these different things we can talk about. But you're talking about millions and millions of dollars that are being spent to help offset costs and do for participation, and then also to do projects and different things to really give kids every advantage they can to develop their skills.
Yeah, and you wrote, I think it was like $100 million in net receipts in 2020.
Yeah, and net receipts are, you have your total sales,
yeah,
and you have to give out prizes. Right. And so basically 85% of every dollar spent on a pull tab, bingo, charitable gambling goes back to the player. So you have that 15 cents multiplied by many, many, many. So it was $100 million in net receipts that these 183 associations combined for last year.
And that's a year where I imagine it was down a little bit because of COVID and whatnot.
Yeah. 2019 was the high point so far. And then obviously because of the shutdowns and different things, everybody took a step back in 2020. But in talking to people, once everything opened back up, the gambling just skyrocketed at rates that they haven't seen before. So I don't know if there's just pent up, whatever, that people wanted to get back in bars and play pull tabs and bingo. So they're on pace for, I imagine 2021 is going to be a record year because of the surge that people all around the metro are seeing.
And a lot of this is electronic pull tabs now, right? Which was a big discussion point when they were trying to fund the Viking Stadium, was it not?
Well, that's what it is. Yeah. That came in, however long the US Bank Stadium's been around, it really if you remember at the time, Michael, it started off really slow. Nobody was using them. People were still just their habits were the paper pull tabs. They just wanted to do the paper ones. As people got more comfortable, maybe with technology and just being on their phones or just whatever, seeing them more, we have seen double-digit growth in e-tabs, electronic pull tabs, in the last couple of years, to where it's a nice complement to the paper tabs. I think people are now shocked by how much revenue that's produced. And if you remember this last legislative session, it came up where some legislator proposed a bill that people feared would take away e-tabs, because I guess the e-tab games, when the bill was written, they were supposed to be a facsimile of paper tabs. They're supposed to be like paper tabs.
Okay. Like
just electronic version of them. Apparently they're not that now. They look more like slot machines.
Okay.
And they fear like that goes against the intent of the rule. There's a lot of pretty heated dialogue about that, because proponents of e-tabs and where they are now fear that if you make them go back to what they were and make the the game makers change their technology. They're just going to say it's too costly. We're just going to do away with e-tabs altogether. Long story short, it didn't make it through the legislature. Okay. It wasn't put in a bill. So, but I don't think that's the last we've heard of it. And the legislators who are trying to get that changed have said that's not the last word of it. So I'm guessing this is going to come up in the future. But yes, e-tabs are a big reason why charitable gambling was at $2.1 billion last year.
And that total, obviously, like you said, we got the net receipts, and you've got some individual associations that, take in hundreds of $1,000s a year in receipts to fund things. Now, my question, I guess, as you kind of looked at this and looked at what this is primarily funding, how did we get to a point where we needed this to fund things?
Well, let's take like White Bear Lake Hockey, for example. They're number 2 in total sales, number 2 in the state, number 2 in net. Total sales last year, $24 million.
I mean, that's $24 million for one youth hockey association.
And that's in 7. They're in 7 different bars and restaurants up there. Now, prizes were $21 million, so their net was $3.5 million. Now they didn't get 3.5. I mean, their operation is incredible, and I followed them. I mean, they have a gambling manager who oversees 65 employees, and they pay $100,000 a month in taxes. It's just staggering how big that is. But so a couple of years ago, their city-owned rink came to them and said, "Hey, we need a new refrigeration system. The old one's outdated, doesn't work. It's going to have to be replaced. If it's not replaced, they're going to have to sell the building and close it down. And then where are their 800 kids that are in the program going to practice?" And so they put up $2.5 million to fix their refrigeration system, all from gambling proceeds. My kids played basketball growing up. So they didn't play hockey. So I didn't realize how expensive ice time is for if you're a big association. Some of these associations said they're spending $600,000, $700,000 a year just to rent ice so their kids can practice. Well, you can either offset that with gambling money, or you can offset that with parents paying it. And so imagine if you put that bill on the parents, how expensive that would be to play hockey. Just there's scoreboards that need to be replaced. There's dugouts that need to be built. There are officials that need to be paid. And so all this money is being used to really kind of offset some of the costs that parents see. And if you have kids in sports, you know how expensive it is. I talked to one gambling manager, Bob Adams, who also does wrestling. He said it would shut down a lot of sports. It would devastate sports if you did not have gambling revenue. And people told me that the number of kids that are able to play would be greatly reduced because the cost would just be too much for their family.
Now, is this because sports have just gotten, more expensive, bigger business in general? Coaches sometimes get more, you'd be paying for turf fields and things like that. This isn't the 70s and 80s anymore where sports were, a little bit just more, the cost associated with running sports wasn't as great. So I guess my question is, how much of this is funding want and how much of this is funding need in some cases?
I would say both. It's a little bit of keeping up with the other suburbs,
right?
You're chasing a little bit. Now, some of it is, I don't know what the ice time or the ice bills were 70s, 80s, but I can't imagine they weren't $700,000 back then. So a lot of that is, when you're talking about equipment rental, fixing a refrigeration system in a arena so it doesn't start. But they're also using the funding to build dry land facilities. It has these state-of-the-art equipment. I went down to Apple Valley and they had a skating treadmill that was $100,000. Well, other associations are getting these things, right? And so it's a little bit of that. Do they need that? Could your kids develop without it? Well, they have historically without an indoor skating treadmill, but other programs are doing it and making that investment in kids. And so you don't want to get left behind in what you're doing to help give your kids every advantage to compete. And so I think it's a combination of things that absolutely are essential, and then some that you're just trying to give kids every advantage you can to develop their skills because the thing is, when you get to the high school level, you're trying to win state tournaments and those type of things and have the best program possible. And so it doesn't start when you come in ninth grade. It starts down in the youth programs and the feeder system and giving those kids every opportunity.
Is there any, concern? I feel like, I'm going to probably write about this and broach this as the year goes on here, but I feel like gambling itself has become more mainstream in recent years. There's, a lot of pro leagues that used to just distance themselves a lot from gambling are now kind of cozying up to the notion of it. You're seeing different states legalizing, sports wagering, things like that. This is a little different. Like, are there people who have a problem with the intermingling of youth sports and what essentially is gambling?
Yes, I talked to the director of, and I'll forget the name of the gambling alliance here in Minnesota, North Star. I think it's North Star Gambling Alliance. And that was precisely her point, is that gambling is becoming more accepted as a societal norm. It's more, you're seeing, as you mentioned, states are legalizing it, and it's just becoming more part of our lives now. And her concern is just the protections and the, education of it. And by law, at these pull tabs booths, there has to be a hotline number there that if you have a problem gambling, call this number. She said it needs to go well beyond that, right? And her association stat was that there are 200,000 Minnesotans who fall on the problem gambling spectrum. Now that spectrum is probably pretty wide, and what we would, a person they put on the spectrum probably is not what we consider a problem gambler, but it's a spectrum.
Sure.
But their concern is, as gambling becomes more popular and more prevalent in our lives, that there are what they call guardrails to prevent people from losing their houses or losing their families and those type of things. And she has seen people that get addicted to pull tabs, and they to a point where it interferes with their life. And so, I think that, there are people that there are, as gambling, as states, each individual states are discussing whether they should legalize it and the way in the pros and cons. There's definitely people that are against it because of, they know where gambling can lead.
Maybe we should go all in. We could set lines for White Bear Lake against Blaine.
I know and that's the thing, Mike. The hockey associations typically have the most sophisticated and the largest gambling operations. I think 5 of the top 10 in total sales are hockey. Of all the associations, there's
hockey's expensive too.
It's expensive sport, and that's the thing. It's the most expensive. When you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in ice time, that other sports just don't have to deal with that. And equipment's expensive. And so, but the hockey people, they've done it for a long time. They're very sophisticated. They know how to, really pick the right restaurants to get into, because that they're bars. That's very important, because people said if you get into the wrong bar, it's doomed to fail, and then you got a big problem. These are sophisticated, big businesses that these associations are running, and it's not parent volunteers. You need a gambling manager. That is their job. It's a paid position to run this operation, because you're talking about millions of dollars in cash, and that can go sideways if there's not proper oversight, which the state gambling control board has audits, and everybody has each association does their own independent audits, because you have to be accountable for this, because if you're not, and there's theft or there's kinds of problems, the state's going to come knock on your door, and then you're going to have a real problem, and you could lose your license.
Well, yeah. And I was going to ask you about that. Maybe that's kind of the final point here. You talked about, guardrails to protect against, people having problems gambling. I'm sure there's all sorts of, if you don't have the right professionals in place, you think you wrote about this in the story, which again is on Star Tribune, startribune.com, still really good piece. Go check it out. There's with so much money at play and cash, in a lot of cases, cash only, you got to imagine I mean, maybe the temptation is the wrong word, but just the opportunity for things to go sideways, like you said, is there.
Well, no, I think there is probably temptation with some people, and there's opportunity. But in talking to people who run those, the association presidents and from the Gambling Control Board, there is so much oversight that is required in accounting and detailed bookkeeping that is required by state, that I had one gambling manager or one association president told me, if you steal any money of any substance from your gambling proceeds, you're going to get caught. It's just a matter of when, because you have to have detailed reporting to the state, monthly reports. There has to be audits. The state does independent reviews. Sometimes the Department of Revenue will every so often it's not uncommon for these associations to get audited 3 times in a year. And so it would be, but there's, they constantly, the state gambling control board constantly educates these associations that say, it cannot be a one person operation, because that's just, you're opening yourself up for problems there. But I think as the money has grown, the revenue, as gambling's grown, and it's become a bigger and bigger operation, I think there is a lot more oversight and regulations in the business. And so people say it would be awfully hard to steal and get away with it, but it is concerns for those people, because you have to be vigilant, and you have to, every receipt and everything has to be accounted for on a monthly basis when you present those reports to your board.
Well, once again, Chip, great stuff in the story. Really enjoyed having you on the podcast. I just love stories where I learned something where I had no idea what a big business this was. And it sounds like you didn't either until you started digging into it.
Yeah, that was the thing. It was fun to report. Early on, it was complicated because there's just something foreign. I didn't understand, like I said, I'm not into the pull tab thing. And so I found it fascinating, just this relationship and how important charitable gambling is to youth sports being able to survive and operate and do the things that they do right now. And I hope people, there's some sticker shock for me in reading those numbers. And I hope people give the story a read and maybe learn something about it too.
Absolutely. Chip, great stuff. We'll talk to you again down the road. All right.
Thank you.
Great conversation with Chip Scoggins. Always love to catch up with Chip. For such a well-reported story, you can still go read that. Star Tribune, startribune.com. On a tangentially related gambling note, Bally Sports North, Bally Sports Channels. They want to do the gambling eventually. This is a carriage update. This sounds like, from what I read in Sports Business Journal Media, John Auerend, who's writes about this, does a really good job. He says they got there's an extension in the negotiations between Dish and Sinclair. Sinclair being the parent company of that runs all these Bally Sports North channels that used to be Fox Sports North. There's been an impasse between these two. It sounds like. There's talk about a whole bunch of local broadcast stations going away. That seems like if a deal gets done, that there's a deal for these Bally Sports North regional sports networks that could follow, and the terms of the deal, Sports Business Journal is reporting, could be such that other carriers would be interested enough in these terms and would want to get those same terms. So pay attention in the next couple days to some movement potentially on this front. There could be some good news for Dish customers who want to watch the Twins, the Wolves, the Wild. I'm not getting my hopes up until it actually happens. The Lynx, the United, pretty much everybody but the Vikings. And maybe, we'll see if there's others that follow. Obviously, the streaming wars, we've covered that. I wonder if this will have an impact on some of that. That we need to wait and see on. We even need to wait and see if this Dish thing really happens. But there could be finally some good news on this front, and thank you to Matt Wells for pointing me in this direction. Speaking of good news, it sounds like the Russia threat of Kirill Kaprizov going to play over there is not materializing. No surprise there. Nothing imminent on the contract front, but just like Chip Scoggins said on the show 12 days ago, he doesn't expect anything less than the Wild signing Kaprizov, so let's watch for that to happen as well in not too long. Let's finish quick with the cooler. I had a thought the other day when Byron Buxton was homering for the Saints, when Joe Ryan was piling up 9 strikeouts in 4 innings in his debut, and Jose Miranda keeps having an impressive season, more than impressive. Thank goodness the Saints are here this year, right? With the Twins playing so poorly by and large this season, at least you have this team over in St. Paul where you can have a shred of excitement about the future. You'd love to see all of those guys, especially Buxton, back in a Twins uniform sooner rather than later. But just the fact that you have that option now strikes me as, I appreciated it when it happened. I appreciate it even more in the context of the season that is happening right now. And they're gone on the road for a couple weeks, but they do have a couple more home series left this season. I think September 7th is when they are back in town. That'll do it for today. Thanks for joining me so much. Drew McGarry expected to be on Wednesday's show. More Vikings talk with Drew. Should be tons of fun. Thanks for joining me so much today. Read Star Tribune, StarTribune.com. I'm Michael Rand. We'll be back on Wednesday.